now in Thornton Hall, a really good example of a failure on the part of the state to move in a timely way to provide new facilities and resources even when those resources are available. It's clear that in how those decisions were made, the last lens that was applied to that decision-making was the human rights lens. There was no consideration in any real form of the rights and needs of those who would be using those services, the patients who are meant to be at the heart of the service, according to Vision for Change, and of course their carers. And again, mental health promotion and prevention is given very, very little attention. A major focus of our work in the coming years will be in the area of stigma reduction. So we believe there is slow development of inadequacies within the mental health services, and that they are significantly attributable to insufficient government funding. That 20 to 30% of all health disability is related to mental health problems, yet mental health services, as you all know, are allocated approximately 6.3% of the national health budget. The World Health Organization suggests that 12% should be a ballpark percentage of health spend in the area of mental health. Equally, there is a five-fold difference between resources available to the least and worst funded services, which those less funded being those with highest levels of socioeconomic deprivation and hence greatest need. So again, discrimination in terms of people's ability to access the service, with a clear indication that socioeconomic status is a factor in that. And where funding should be related to improving effectiveness, there is no or little information on the effectiveness of services and no commitments by government to improve funding for mental health services research. So no real transparency, ultimately, about how funding is spent, where it's spent, and what the outcomes are. The World Health Organization has described mental health as a neglected right globally, and we would certainly believe that mental health is a neglected human right globally. They actually went on to say that mental health is a global human rights emergency. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right of Health said that mental health is among the most grossly neglected elements of the right to health. Of course, they're talking in a global context, so some might say that they're perhaps speaking specifically to developing countries or developing nations, perhaps to the global south. But indeed, the rapporteur and the World Health Organization have gone on to point out that they're not speaking exclusively in that context, that this truly is a global human rights emergency. Fiona Crowley is going to speak to you for a few moments now, just to take you through the practicalities of our campaign, and then hopefully we'll talk about ways in which we believe that you can use this approach to both promote your advocacy for patients and to promote your advocacy for the kind of reform to how services are delivered and resourced. Fiona.
He'll be back, I'll be brief. Oh, and I'm loud, sorry. Yeah, can you all hear me? Great. Sorry, I think we've kind of got the graveyard shift and it's very hard to follow Des. He's so powerful, but we'll try. Essentially, Colm has taken you through the fact that human rights are inextricably linked to mental health. But we're not here to talk about human rights and mental health in any sort of abstract or legal sense. Amnesty International is a campaigning organisation. That's what we do. We campaign for governments to live up to their obligations under human rights standards. Ireland has voluntarily signed up to ratify the two conventions that Colm was talking about earlier, and yet it does so expecting pretty much never to have to implement them, and it is our job as a campaigning organisation to raise awareness of that. Colm mentioned how we got into the area of mental health first, and we approached the area quite cautiously and in fact have discovered it's such a massively complex area. So we set ourselves two modest short-term objectives when we started working in the area in 2003. The first was just to increase public and political awareness of the fact that mental health is a human rights issue and that what is happening within Ireland's mental health services is an abuse of human rights. And as Colm mentioned, the human rights framework also addresses the human rights of people working in the service. And I know for many are struggling with, in adverse circumstances, to provide a really good service and deliver innovations and so on. People have a right to live, as Colm said, in a health and safe and dignified working environment. So we wanted to increase awareness publicly and politically, while of course our primary focus for the first 2 years was on the new national mental health policy that was being discussed. So we pretty much focused our attention on the fact that it would actually be produced, that it would be human rights based, and that importantly for us it would be cross-departmental. To us, a policy, as had been the plan of the then minister, that addresses just mental health services, leaves all the other government departments off the hook. It fails to address what are the critical supports in people's lives, employment, housing, education, matters like that. And it really leaves it up to a mental health service to deal with the fallout of those sort of systems. So that was the focus of our campaign in the first instance. And I actually spoke in 2003 at your 2003 annual conference, if any of you recall me. But you'll look very young. Then in 2006, after A Vision for Change was published, we were immediately concerned that while it seemed like a very good policy, that it would likely not be implemented, that the fate of the 1984 policy, Planning for the Future, would befall this too. So we immediately set about co-founding the Irish Mental Health Coalition, of which you might be aware, but also lobbying ourselves for the critical infrastructure for its actual delivery. I don't think we were successful, and I'll move straight on. So for that reason, this sort of generally describes sort of our Amnesty's typical sort of campaign activities. Sometimes people just see the postcards and the posters and so on. Most of what we do is direct lobbying, is directly engaging with decision makers, meetings with ministers, civil servants, HSE and so on, and making submissions to or about government. We also use the media, of course, especially local media. We've about 27 local groups throughout the country that are very active, and we also have a new lobbying network for people who aren't necessarily Amnesty members but want to engage more consistently in monthly actions, and they've been really successful at getting loads of local media coverage, because that's really where the political system is most sensitive to pressure at the local constituency. And we've also been engaging with partner organisations, including the PNA, on specific initiatives over the years. So at the moment, the state of play today is that, of course, the advances that we have seen is that we do have a vision for change. We very much welcomed this policy. We particularly welcomed the fact that it is very broad-reaching, very comprehensive, addressing not just the traditional mental health service, but issues that matter to people like advocacy services, peer support services, the right of people using services to be involved in planning and decision-making and so on. As I said, we were particularly welcoming of the fact that a vision for change also addresses the role of a number of government departments, Department of Justice, Department of Education and so on. The advance also, of course, is that an independent monitoring group was established, and I know that Des referred to that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We've also seen the 2007 National Economic, Social and Social Forum Report on Mental Health and Social Inclusion. The recommendations in that seem to have gone nowhere. And as Colm mentioned, Ireland does plan to ratify the UN Disability Convention. It's a very strong convention, and Amnesty would have lobbied separately the Department of Foreign Affairs on that. We also, of course, welcome the fact that cross-departmental action of some sort is planned under the Office of the Minister for Disability, and the very fact of its establishment with a cross-departmental remit. I'll return to that as well. And also, we have been very aggrieved at the lack of accountability and how funding, particularly expenditure, is tracked. And the Minister has made several gestures about establishing mechanisms to track expenditure. Human rights is all over the Mental Health Commission's customer charter, and the Irish Human Rights Commission, which would be the ultimate human rights watchdog set up by government under the Good Friday Agreement. In its strategic plan for 2007 to 11, mental health is all over it. So we very much hope that they will actually bring the human rights